This podcast was recorded on traditional Denizal land.
Hello, it's Trey. Welcome to Before the Peace. Given that it is the last episode of 2023, I wanted to do a year in review episode. However, I thought that might be pretty boring hearing me talk for about an hour. So I decided to do something different. And right now I have a colleague of mine, Greg, who is a producer for a couple of podcasts for Energeticcity, and he also helps out with Before the Peace as well. He's going to lead the pod in a second here and interview me. Before we get into that, though, I want to say this podcast wouldn't be possible without the help of Troyer Ventures. Troyer has been serving our community and the energy industry with tank and vac trucks since 2000. They are built on the principles of hard work, service, and community, and they are proud to offer the financial support to make this program possible. Greg, Energeticcity, you're the reader engagement lead. I mean, your title is always changing.
Well,
you do so much for the company as a whole, and you're the behind the scenes guy is what I would say. But for some of those who don't know, like, I produce the podcast, but you kind of help me out. I would call you the co-producer. You listen back to it, give me notes and things like that, and then you put up things on social media. You have listened to the podcast since Jenna and I started it, I believe, in 2021, the latter part of 2021. So I guess before I completely hand over the reins to you and have you interview me, I want to know a little bit about, your time listening to the podcast. And I know I didn't tell you this beforehand, so I didn't give you pre-questions, but what is an episode, maybe your favorite episode or an episode that stood out to you over, the past, almost 2 years now?
Yeah, for sure. Like you said, it's crazy to think that Before the Peace has been going on for 2 years now, which is awesome. Congratulations. That's really cool. I remember when I first started, the first couple months, you and Jenna were talking about this idea about potentially doing Before the Peace. And it was one of those, and I know obviously a lot of it also came from Troyer. They helped a lot with the idea as well. But yeah, I was there on the ground floor when you guys started talking about it. I was always very interested to see what you guys were going to do with it. And then obviously, this is a big thing we'll get into later in the podcast. Your co-host left, which was Jenna. And so that, left a lot of responsibilities for you. And so what I ended up starting doing, like you said, was I started just being your co-producer in the sense of just double checking everything. The other thing I do for Before the Peace, as well as all the podcasts you see from energeticcity.ca, is I make all those dumb clips on TikTok and stuff. Not dumb, sorry.
They're not dumb. No.
The small clips you see on TikTok. The funny thing about those clips too is like, it's just a tiny little clip, and it's like there's so much more that goes on with all those clips, and I just want everybody to know, hey, if you see those clips on TikTok, those are great. But make sure you go listen to the full episode because there's a lot more that happened. But yeah, that's something I've been doing this year as well. And like you said, I've been listening to every podcast just to make sure, thoughts if there's an audio issue or something like that, those fun behind the scenes things. But yeah, it's been very interesting to see you guys, how you guys have grown in the last 2 years. Obviously you guys were very, when you were first starting the podcast, it's a very different spot. You have experience in radio, but podcasting is its own thing. And, handling how you deal with guests and stuff like that is always fun. I've heard some fun behind the scenes stories of going into the middle of nowhere to record some stuff. So always a good time.
And the episodes that haven't been released too.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Well, I didn't know if we were going to mention that, but
I won't mention specifics about it, but yeah, there was a case where we had spent, I think we were out there like half the day.
Yep.
And, we had a wonderful conversation, but the people we were talking with, they have, it wasn't a lawyer. They have like a communications person that they've hired out of a major market. And I say market like it's radio, a major city.
Yep.
And they had suggested after we'd done the interview and this communications person had seen it, they requested that we didn't publish.
Well, and that's the funny thing, that's not even the only one. Remember, there's been more throughout the year, and I've been kind of behind the scenes discussing that with you. So it's been interesting to see how that goes. When you asked earlier, like my favorite episode, for me, like Before the Peace is such an interesting concept of let's talk to the local Indigenous community, get their perspective on things and the history of the area. Cause like you said, they've been living here for way longer than we have. Right. Yeah. So for me though, the side I always find the most interesting was how they relate to industry, only because in my employment history and my personal history, I've only ever heard, non-Indigenous perspectives on that.
Yeah.
So it was really fascinating to hear their perspectives on it. So two that really stood out to me, especially, and maybe this is recency bias because they're really recent. I really enjoyed Stuart Cameron's episode, the most recent episode, just because getting his perspective as somebody who worked in the oil and gas and then transitioned into a position where he helped bridge the gap between Indigenous communities and oil and gas. I thought was really interesting.
Integrated his heritage into his work.
Yeah,
which
exactly.
is really
right?
cool. His career. Which
And
I thought
again,
was
seeing
awesome.
how not just oil and gas, but all industries have progressed as we've increased our relationships with Indigenous communities. The other one I thought was really fascinating was Shona Nelson, because again, you just got to see way more behind the scenes things of how bands work and how nations are structured and how they manage themselves. I thought that was super fascinating. Again, as somebody who's worked in a couple different industries and stuff like that, just hearing about those stories and how that works is very interesting to me.
Yeah, those two specifically as well, like, going into those interviews, I obviously put in the research but you never know how it's going to happen. And I was very proud of both of those episodes that you're saying. Like, I'm proud of all of them. Obviously, there are some that cater more to like what I was interested in or the conversation or whatever the case may be. But these are ones of examples of more research going into it, because my biggest thing too is these are very experienced, smart people. And I, have to, they've been working in their specific positions, their industries for a long, long time, right? So they know things. So then coming forward with me having to ask them questions, I don't want to just, give them basic questions. I want to try and delve in. We got an hour. I want to try to delve into as much as I can. So, with those, it's the difficulty of like, did I do enough research for this to be a good enough episode, to really put it out there? So it's nice to hear that I've had good feedback from both of those episodes. And Shona, I believe, liked the episode as well, which is awesome because she's a very particular person. I think you have to be when you're in certain positions. And so, I'm glad those are the two episodes because there's so many great ones, but those ones specifically, I would put them up there too.
And like I said, it comes down to really just preference about, but like you said, they're all interesting, and like hearing all the stories is really good. Like hearing, Gary Oker wants to make a comic book character, type of thing is really interesting. So, but yeah, no, again, for anybody listening to this, if this is your first one for some reason, hey, make sure to go check out our old podcast. They've evolved throughout the years. You've evolved throughout the years, and it's just interesting to see the progress. So yeah, that's kind of my thoughts on Before the Peace. Again, we're planning our 2024 stuff, so hopefully we can have an update soon for you guys about stuff that's going on. But it's my turn to kind of
it's the reins is yours. You are now a Before the Peace podcast host. You're my new co-host. Yep. Sorry, Jenna.
So let's, before we get into the Jenna situation, let's start with the beginning. So this has been 2 years officially. The first episode was November 2020. One, I believe. Yep. So it's been 2 years now. What are some ways you think you have improved in your podcasting?
Just before I get into that, just a note too for, again, if you're a new listener or if you just started up this year or even last year, our first podcast episode was with Gary Oker. And then this year I was able to do a follow-up with him and talk to him about some more things. The 2 years, so before I got here to Energeticcity, I should say, you did mention it. I was in radio initially. That's where I started out with. That's what I went to school for. And then I kind of went down this path of journalism. But even before that, I've been doing multiple podcasts for many years, like hit or miss. You know what I mean? Like you do it for a couple months or whatever the case may be, something happens and then you stop. So I've had podcasts before with other people as well, but never with a company, right? Because when you're on your own, you have to structure it. You have to put up your schedule. You have to be disciplined and making sure you're putting out episodes when you say you're putting them out. That doesn't always pan out. We know through the pandemic, many people started podcasts that never continued with them.
Including myself, yeah.
And myself as well. I had two that I started and then stopped with. But then when I got here and this idea got brought up, I initially was like, I didn't want to start another one because I didn't want to commit to something that I felt like I couldn't put my all into. There was, a lot going on. In 2021 especially, we were really figuring out what we want the future of Energeticcity to look like. And part of that was implementing podcasts. And I was just iffy on the idea. But Jenna, all credit goes to her. She is the heart and soul. Like, Troyer did come up to us and talk about the idea. And then, Jenna ran with it and she was very passionate about it. And she did not stop coming into my office. She she knew that I was interested in the topic, specifically with Indigenous advocacy and just the curiosity that I had and being a Métis individual myself, that and going through my own I'm not going to say identity crisis, but just finding my own identity within Métis culture too. It kind of aligns, but I will say it was definitely Jenna who pushed it. And then once it got started, obviously it started off on a little bit of a, learning curve. Like we were really, and that's why we picked Gary too, because he's such a well-known person in the community. He's very used to talking. We knew that it can be, if not the first episode, a trial episode to kind of get the wheels spinning, because Jenna had no experience at all. And I will say not a lot of people could probably notice if they listen back to that episode, because she was very committed and she wanted to make sure, after each episode she tried to improve, and that then carried on to me. And then, episodes in the future, I would say the biggest thing that I've improved on was research, is putting in the research, right? Like when I was doing podcasts before, they were niche podcasts. So it was like pro wrestling. And that's something where I am a lifelong fan. I don't need to research pretty much. Like I'll have a computer in front of me if I needed to look at something or a date or whatever the case may be. But for this, it's very important. We don't want to have someone on who is brave enough to tell their story and then not know anything about them and not put in our research. And so the biggest thing was learning how to put in the appropriate amount of research, which again, it wasn't too difficult for me because I am a journalist, but it was also connecting with Jenna, like, and having that communication. Like she would go and do her own research as well. Right. And so that was something new to her. So it was kind of, I guess, working with the co-host and getting that trust and, feeling each other out was something that we definitely learned to do. But the thing is Jenna and I were friends, right? Like we were friends. So it kind of was easy. Another thing too is the pace of a podcast, right? When you start out, especially, I guess the biggest thing you can notice with Jenna and even myself on those first couple podcasts is we're so excited. And we're rushing through everything, right? There was one episode, I think it was within the first or 5 guests we had, where we ran out of questions 20 minutes into the podcast.
Oh, no.
Because we just started rushing through all of them. And then the guest was answering other questions while answering the question we asked. So then, honestly, it was just like, Jenna did ask some things, but like she kind of looked at me and then I just went journalist brain and just started like coming up with things in the moment or from what they had said, which is a skill in itself, which again, this is something else I think I've honed in on, because as a news director, I'm not writing or doing interviews as much as I used to when I was actually, just a journalist, just a reporter. So the podcast gives me that side to do my research and things like that too, which is awesome. But yeah, that was a big thing for me. It was just rushing the pace, and really making the guests as comfortable as you can with them not knowing you, right? Like, so Stuart, I met him once beforehand, and then we really didn't know each other. But I think he wanted to kind of feel me out. So we met here at the office, chatted a little bit, and then that podcast was great. Like, and I think that's huge, is if you have some sort of rapport, connection, at least an understanding, it will go a long way. Like I can't tell you, and I'm being brutally honest, over all our episodes, there's not one like I can pick apart, like that stands out in my mind. Everyone has that. When it's 2 years and a bit we've been doing this podcast. You would think there is some that would be in our minds of like, oh, we could have done better here, or like one that stood out where there could have been a lot more that was better in the podcast. Like we could have worked on a lot more there, but there wasn't at all. So I think that's a huge plus. Again, I'm biased.
Only a little bit.
But I honestly think, it's just been such a good run.
I'm glad you've been enjoying it, right? Yeah. That's a big thing too. It's like, it's hard to do this many episodes, this many years without actually enjoying the podcast. That's a good sign that you enjoy it as well.
Yeah. And I've heard from other podcast hosts too, where, after a while, there's one of two things. It starts to become a job, or it just starts to become part of your life and you love it, right? And I think it's the latter for me, definitely, right? Like obviously it's a part of work, but it's definitely something that I look forward to in the conversations.
So like we've touched on a couple times now, a major thing that happened this year was Jenna leaving. Like you said, she was part of the heart and soul of the podcast when you first got started. She's part of the reason it got started. Like, what has it been for you transitioning from a duo to a solo podcaster? And, you know, how have things changed since Jenna has left?
So I think the biggest thing is obviously having that spare voice. Anyone who works in broadcasting or podcasting or anything along that realm, it can be a lot easier if you have a good co-host to bounce things off of, to have a conversation. If you get lost with something, you know, the other host could pick it up, kind of thing. So there was that. I guess I already had the experience, so I wasn't like worried. I wasn't nervous about it. I was fine. I guess the one thing that stuck out in my head was my voice and Jenna's voice. Like, I have a deeper voice. Mine can be taken more serious. Obviously, I don't know if people have that opinion of me on the podcast, but you, I know, probably do, Greg. I'm not a serious, like, I'm a goofy guy. But sometimes that doesn't come across with my voice in the podcast. And also some of the questions that I were putting out were, you know, not a little more hard hitting. I wouldn't say they were hard hitting questions, but I would go into some more serious things. I would go into more questions with industry or, you know, certain issues and things like that. Racism was one of them. And not that Jenna wouldn't, but I just was comfortable doing that because I have before, just with my career.
Well, I think speaking on that, I think it also just comes back to your guys' histories with your personal histories and also your guys' relationships with Indigenous communities.
Yeah.
I mean, another thing that impacts Jenna a lot is her kids. So one of those things she tended to ask a lot was stuff that related to the kids. And so obviously she talked about a lot more stuff, but that's an example of something she has that you don't, that influences the type of questions she asks.
Yeah. And so we had this cool connection where we never said it, but we knew which topics we were bringing up, like who was asking what. And we kind of mentioned like, oh, you're bringing this one up. Or she would say, can you bring this one up? But after, like, it was just kind of a in passing, right? And we definitely kind of had this understanding, and it was just natural. It was great. And obviously I miss her a bunch because she was great to the podcast. So one thing that was in my head when I was doing it by myself was just the energy too. She has this natural energy about her, and people gravitate towards her. And I felt that it was very much needed for the pod. It was almost like a Beauty and the Beast kind of mentality, right? Like, she had that energy. She had, the questions of being a parent, and also the lighthearted questions. She's just such a sweetheart. And then, you move over to me, and then I'm asking about your childhood and like all these serious questions. Not that she wouldn't, but my worry was that it would have less of that split of, kind of journalism aspect, and then, a lighthearted aspect, which I think she brought. So that's one thing I was, I'm not gonna say worried about, but one thing I thought of. And I don't know if it's really a worry this year, but I do think the podcast has changed with just having me. It definitely is different. But that was definitely the one thing that I was kind of thinking about. But I think it's went pretty good. Honestly, the hardest part is just, the extras. So like social media and things like, I don't have time to be doing that. And that was what Jenna was doing, right? So that's one thing. I know this is part of one of your X questions, but that's one thing moving into next year I want to improve on 100%. is social media and content there too, which most likely you'll be involved in some way, shape, or form if you say yes to me. But I think it's went really well. I'm confident in what we're putting out. I've heard from outside individuals that the podcast is still really good, and that people talk about it and listen to it, and we see that people are listening to it. And then it's also nice too that I get you to listen back to the episodes and critique it. And I know you're always honest with me. So like even the Stewart episode, it was really cool to hear like, this was a good episode. I was really interested in it. So it's been different, but in my typical Trey fashion, with long-winded rants, shortening it down. yeah, it was a transition, but I feel like it was one I took well.
Yeah, and like you said, hey, Jenna, we miss you. You ever come back, let us know, and we'll try to get you in on an episode type of thing.
She's such a beautiful human.
Yeah. So yeah, another question for you. There was a lot of big stories that came out in 2023. I mean, we had the treaty land entitlement case happen. We have the urban reserve making way more progress in Fort St. John. You know, Sequoia opened up a lot more. They had a lot of renovations and stuff, so people can go check it out. What were your takeaways of 2023? And, you know, were there certain things you want to cover more or that you wish you had been able to cover?
So I'll start with that, the last part of that question first. So, and mentioning Sequoia. So we just did a story on Sequoia and the update about them opening up for people to go in and check it out with all the new upgrades and everything like that. That was and also the podcast where I talked with Alyssa with the update a couple months ago. That was the first time I had been to Sequoia in like a year. The last time was before the last winter, which we didn't, Alyssa and I, who, for those of you who don't know, is the executive director of the Heritage Society, the Sequoia Heritage Society. She didn't even realize, and we were just like, oh, what the heck? I wish, not even just from a podcast standpoint, but from Energeticcity, which is what we're also delving in on with the stories. I wish we did more of the updates on the progress that was going on and talk to her. The thing is I do talk with Alyssa a lot about certain things going on, but I hadn't actually been down at the site while those upgrades were happening. So that was one thing, which I would say is kind of a small thing, because we still did do an update, which is awesome about everything going on there. But another thing too is I'd say we covered all the major, quote unquote issues, topics, we'll say, coming from Indigenous communities in the Northeast. There were some things more so on the court side of things that we still need to cover. But I think things I wish I covered more is simply just with our Indigenous Voices reporter. My goal for that is to just really get more into the community. And we've kind of put a foot in, but in all the First Nation communities in the Northeast. So, a vague question to that is I just want more, like a more of community, of what's happening in the community. Not like these, don't get me wrong. These are important to put out everything going on with the Urban Reserve, TLE. The story we did on the Montney Reserve from Jerry Tachi was a huge story, and it was super interesting. And it was history that, from what we had seen, had not been really reported on too much. So it was cool for Doig to trust us with that story, for Jerry Atachi, an elder, a former chief, to trust us with that story and to publish it. Mm-hmm. And, we worked, well, I won't say we, well, I did help, obviously, as the news director.
You got brought up in
a lot of guidance with Manav, the reporter at the time who wrote the story. It took us, I think it was a month and a half.
Yeah, but it did get brought up in the podcast first, because you had your episode with Jerry.
It stemmed from the podcast.
It stemmed from the podcast, and you were able to delve into it more with a written article.
Before the piece of story and Craig Armstrong.
Yeah, exactly right. So,
it started off when we had Jerry Atachi on, and it went from there where, honestly, immediately after that episode, I went to Manav and I'm like, we need to do this story.
Yeah.
This is so interesting, and it's huge. It's a huge piece of history. We need to do this story. And it took a little bit, right? And it was just like the burial story we did, a couple weeks ago that Jordan sunk. This is our video reporter, sports reporter. She's also the associate editor. She wears a bunch of hats. She wrote the story. It took her a month and a half, I believe, too. Mm-hmm. And it was a phenomenal story. I'm super proud of the work that the reporters put in on those. Yeah, I guess it kind of combined the takeaways, and wish what I covered more of is definitely just the community stuff.
Yep.
Community. What's happening in your community? We have stuff from Fort St. John talking about, the 12-year-old girls raising money for the hospital foundation, doing a lemonade stand, kind of you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like little community things. And we need to build those relationships. And then from there, we can then tackle other, topics. But the problem is, all these bigger topics, not all of them, but some of them we're getting from government or, banned governments, and we're not getting it from the actual members and the people. And that's what I want. That's where I really want us to get into. But, with due time.
With due time, like you said, the main goal for Before the Peace was just to really grow that connection, not only between us and the communities, but also just everybody who's listening with the communities, right? And like trying to share their stories and offer a platform and grow that connection, right? So yeah, it's just something we're continue to work on, and hopefully we'll get there next year. And I mean, even if we make progress next year, it's never going to end, right? You got to constantly do more progress and build that relationship.
There's always going to be work to be done and better ways that we can improve out our coverage, and improve just in general for sure.
So yeah, another question. Any behind the scenes moments you want to share that happened in 2023? That just, something that wouldn't make it on podcast that you just thought was funny or interesting that you just want to share?
The first thing that comes to my mind, and I think I did mention it on the podcast, is when I got our company vehicle stuck on a logging road for multiple hours. I was on my way to Blueberry River First Nation. It was actually my first podcast by myself, my first solo podcast, going to interview Sandra Obsassin at Blueberry River First Nation. And went down the wrong road, following Google Maps, and was stuck there for a couple hours. Had to get our boss to come and pull me out, which, our boss, of course, I had to hear it a little bit. There were some jokes slinging my direction for sure, which was very deserved. But luckily, Sandra, so I missed the podcast because of that. Stuck. But she's like, well, she rescheduled the same day. So I literally, after I got unstuck, I just drove straight there and we did the podcast, which was absolutely awesome. But that's the one, that's the funny one that definitely sticks out of my mind. Do you have any that I'm not thinking of?
I mean,
that I told you?
We hinted at, there's a couple episodes that unfortunately had to get canceled just for certain reasons, which I don't know if we're even allowed to talk about.
That's why those popped in my head too.
Which is fine.
No. I'll mention it. I'll just kind of skirt around it, honestly, just to be safe. So one episode we had a couple months ago, you were talking, today you were talking about, the episodes in the oil and gas industry. I had an episode a couple months ago where I talked to I think he's a CEO of a company that is here in Fort St. John, but they're based out of Calgary. But this individual was also born in the region. He's from Fort St. John, and had a great conversation with him. And, my biggest worry was I didn't want the episode to be all about, this is my company, all the great things we do. It was more so about, I wanted someone from the oil and gas industry to speak on the relationship between the sector and Indigenous communities. And I thought it was a great episode, but, there was some questions among the office and people involved in the podcast about, just putting it out there and having someone from a company when there's so many other companies in the region, and like, it is kind of promotion for them as well. So I understood that why we had to cut it. It was just unfortunate because it was such a good episode. And I, spent a lot of time researching, came in early to talk to him over Zoom. So it was unfortunate. It was, the second time it had happened, and it was what it was. The first time I, kind of mentioned it earlier, is essentially we were meeting with some people who are part of a First Nation community in the Northeast. And essentially they are trying to reboot the community and do some research, and they're in the midst of court cases. And so they hired an individual who I think is specifically, in the communications sector. And we were communicating a lot with her. We sent her the questions, everything that we wanted to do, our thoughts for the podcast. And we traveled, I think it was like 2.5 hours. Like it was, it was a trip, like it was a day trip for sure. Did the interview, had a great conversation, did a lot of research. And then, once we edited the podcast, put all that time in, we sent it to the communications person, wanted us to send us the episode, which generally I don't do, but in this given situation and the reasoning, we were okay with it. We sent it and she said no. And she said cut out some things. We cut out some things, and then we got back. I think this is not the right time to put it out, and we were kind of, definitely heartbroken because we wanted that story to go out there. The thing with this one is I can't delve into the content of it because they're in the midst of legal. I just want to be careful there. But yeah, that was unfortunate. But also, it was a learning experience, right? And now we know, if we get into those situations again, or if I get into those situations again, then I kind of know how to navigate, or I will know before it happens, before I do all that work. You know what I mean?
It's all a learning experience, right? Even if you have, scrap, 1 to 2 episodes, which sucks because like you said, you made those they were full on episodes, but now you just know going forward, some of the things to watch out for and people to ask, right?
And who knows, they might be released later. I don't know about the one I was talking about the First Nation community, but the oil one, I don't know, maybe.
Yeah.
Who knows if it could.
We'll see.
But that's another hope of mine. I'm glad I got Stuart on because that covered it right there. My biggest thing was, we had talked to a lot of people or asked a lot of questions about the oil and gas industry, but never kind of like delved into it. I felt like the way I wanted to. And the episode that I'm speaking about, I felt like I did and asked, questions that I felt were not hard, but, ones that some people might not be comfortable asking.
Yeah, for sure. No, I listened to that episode before we got canceled. Again, I thought it was very interesting to get that perspective on the situation as well. But like you said, it's just that situation of it's just a complicated situation, and there's always going to be those complicated situations.
So like, for instance, on paper, without like listening to the episode, you put up a social media post with the person's name, who they are, and someone sees it, they're non-Indigenous, they're with an oil and gas company, a CEO, you can start to make assumptions without actually listening to the podcast, which I figured would be the case of like people being like, why?
Yep. But then you listen to
the actual, and again, that was my worry, but the actual podcast, I felt like I did a good job of navigating, and he did a good job of asking or answering the questions. A good job of navigating like what I wanted out of the podcast, but unfortunately it got cut.
Yeah, unfortunately. But like you said, it's just live and learn, and we'll keep plugging away at it.
Yeah.
So before we get into 2024 stuff, just a quick, another quick thing to quickly celebrate. We officially passed 50,000 downloads for Before the Piece in 2023.
Wow.
Yeah, I've told you this, but yeah, it's.
Did you? I did. A lot of things get. I forget stuff. But no, that's awesome.
But thank you so much to everybody who listened this year and last year. We really appreciate everybody out there, and like you said, we're planning our 2024 stuff. We're going to get that to a second, but we really appreciate the support, and make sure if you find the podcast, make sure to follow it. We're going to keep putting out episodes, and make sure to share it. The point of this is to share it with the community and try to grow that understanding.
When Jenna left, there was an opportunity for us to stop. And I kept it going because I think it's important, and everyone still kept listening to it. And from the bottom of my heart, it's huge, right? It's the work I'm putting in isn't for nothing, right? Like, people are actually listening to it. Even if you said 1,000 this year, I wouldn't care, as long as people are listening and they're enjoying it. Because I don't know, right? Like we say all the time, we've been doing it for 2 years. Email us with podcast ideas or guest ideas or content ideas, and no one does. I think we've gotten a couple emails about, people liking the podcast, but nothing about, what we're asking of like, hey, do you want anything else? Or, is there something specifically you want? So that tells me one of two things. People are happy with it, but they're not listening to it. And it seems like it's the former, right? Like, people like the direction that it's going in, or they like it enough to keep listening and not email me. So it's definitely awesome. And I just, to Greg's point, thank you guys so much. That is awesome to hear.
Yeah, so now we're going to kind of get into our plans for 2024. Again, for anybody listening, if you have ideas, or if you have a topic, or if you have anything that you really want to hear in the new year, let us know. We're always open to suggestions. And also, if you are a member of the Indigenous community, you want to be on the podcast, hit us up. Yeah. We're open to anybody. You don't have to be a chief. You don't have to be, somebody like Stuart Cameron, who's like heavily involved in oil and gas. Even if you're just a member of the community, we appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I've had residents ask about that too in the community about coming on, and I'm super open about it. My biggest thing though is, I would love to have a conversation beforehand to see what we talk about.
Yeah, 100%.
Other than that, but I'm super open for people coming on. Like, for the most part, I specifically look out for my guests and go and find them and look for specific ones on like what I want to talk about. But I'm open. Yep. I'm always open to have people on. Actually, January's guest is someone who reached out to me.
Nice.
And so We'll be chatting with him here in a couple weeks in the new year. But yeah, no, reach out for sure.
Now going into 2024, what are some ideas you have? Not saying that we're for sure going to do them, just like potential ideas you have, or some personal goals for your podcasting that you want to, or where you want to see the show next year.
So I did kind of mention it a little bit. My biggest thing is putting a little bit more focus on social media. I feel like I'm in a groove with the actual podcast itself since Jenna left. But as for that extra stuff, the extra content, right? Like whether it be videos or, if we just have little clips of them saying certain things, like if I have just a camera up to record them while we're doing the podcast and then you can clip it, you know what I mean? Like just extra content is something I'm looking at doing. Obviously, I have a lot of tasks and a lot of hats that I wear with my job at Energeticcity. So it is about spare time, but I also think it's about how much energy I want to put into it too. So I definitely think it's something that is possible. And that's kind of what I want to do for 2024, or at least come up with a plan to improve it, whether that's, having someone else within Energeticcity to help me out or whatever the case may be. But that's a big one for me. I don't really have any guests that I like really, really, really want to have. Well, actually, that's a lie. I do have a couple. I want to talk to Judy Desjardins, the chief of Blueberry River First Nation. We've been trying to talk with her, as well as Helen Knott, a local author. We've been trying to get her on for, how long did you say this podcast has been going?
2 years.
2 years, yeah. That's not a dig, Helen. We just really, really, really want to talk with you. But she, she's really busy right now with the release of her second book, which I think is the perfect time. So anyone listening to this, if you are friends or Helen and Judy, please get them in touch with me. I've even had outside people try and get in touch with Helen and Judy to have them on. And there are some other, guests too that I would like to have on or ones. Ryan Dickey. I might be wrong, but I'm pretty sure he's a Fort Nelson First Nation member. And he's definitely a member within Northeast BC. I hope I didn't get that wrong, but I do want to chat with him. He's an artist. I believe he is into like video editing as well. He just does a lot of things, and I just really am interested in him. And obviously I haven't done tons of research into him, but Jenna and I were talking about talking with him because we had seen his website and a lot of the stuff he was doing, and I see him on Facebook. We're friends there, and just like, his path and what he's been doing for the communities. And that's someone I want to talk with as well.
So like you mentioned earlier, this is the first year you had a return guest, which was Gary Oker.
Yeah.
Are there any other guests you want to come back on, talk about other topics, or just delve into more topics?
Yeah. Well, so Gary and Alyssa were returns.
Oh yeah. Alyssa. Sorry.
Yeah.
Alyssa.
Yeah. Roland Wilson, chief of West Moberly. Honestly, probably most of the guests that
almost everybody, because I know
I always say that I want, because there's just so much. Clarence of Sasson.
I know Paulette, you had a lot of stuff you want to talk to her about too.
Yeah, Paulette, there's a lot. And and she's in the midst of the MNBC
election.
The election right now for our district. So, she's someone I want to talk to again. Yeah, there's just so many people, but a big one, just going back on that first year, Roland for sure, especially with Site C coming to a close here in the next couple of years. I won't really want to chat with him about that, and we had talked to him a lot about it before.
There's a lot of people.
There's a lot. That's the first one that comes to my brain.
100%.
Sure.
And like I said, we're open to.
Oh, sorry, Chief McConaughey too at Doig, and actually Shona.
Yeah, basically anybody. We'll take if you want to. If you're a previous episode or you haven't been on us yet, hit us up. We'll definitely we'll discuss that. So another big thing that you and I and our other staff at energeticcity.ca have really trying to make happen that we haven't happened is we really want to do it before the piece live.
Yeah.
So and again, we're open to let us know if you're actually interested in this. Our idea behind it is basically a before the piece where we have a specific topic. Be it, TLE or Site C or something like that, where we have members of the Indigenous communities and maybe members of, another community, that we have a more community conversation about it.
Yeah.
And I actually want to have members of the community be there live and ask questions live directly to you and our guests. So that's something we've been working on. Do you think that's going to happen in 2024?
We're really trying. We've been trying. I think. Mentioning Roland, he has tentatively accepted. So it's just finding, solidifying a date. But no, I think it's going to be huge. I think, it will be huge. It will serve as a platform not only to inform, but also give people the opportunity to ask any questions that they have, like you were saying, right? And I think that is so huge. And it's all about transparency and communication, and we need it across all boards in society. So I think this is a huge thing that we want to happen in 2024. And it's not if it's going to happen, Greg. We're going to make it.
We'll make it happen.
It's happening. It's going to happen. Biggest thing, just going off what Greg's saying, just send me a line saying, I would love for a live podcast. Just email beforethepeace@energeticcity.ca or beforethepeace@moosefm.ca or trey@energeticcity.ca. Just email us and just the line, just so we know there's interest.
Yep.
That's my biggest thing, right? Is we don't know if there is. I think there will be, but I would love to kind of have something tangible. Let's see if people will actually be interested. So please, shoot me an email.
Yeah, 100%. Hey, like I said, we're open to communication. We're open to suggestions. Feel free to let us know, and we'll see what we can do. But yeah, that was kind of mainly it for me. That's what I wanted to ask you about. Any last minute thoughts for
No,
this?
man. I thank you so much because, like I said at the beginning, I think and that's maybe just me being critical. I don't know if people want to listen to me just talking by myself for 30 minutes to an hour. So I appreciate you coming on. And it also, lets people know about you and, another face behind the podcast as well. Because, Greg is a friend of mine as well, a colleague, and, I can go to him for advice and he helps me out with the podcast too. So it's definitely nice for you to come on and give me this time to grill me.
Yeah. I should have come up with harder questions. Like, why are you so bad at this? No, something like that. But
why does your voice suck?
Yeah. Hashtag bring back Jenna. But no, yeah, I appreciate you having me on, and thanks for answering my questions.
No worries. Thank you so much, Greg. That's it for 2023. We will see you guys in January for the start of a new year. Before the Peace 2024. The episode's out in January. Love you guys.
Bye.